Okay, so when we start, maybe you talked a little bit about your family. Maybe you can give a short version what you started to.
Well, like many Americans, my grandparents on my mother's side, they came from German-speaking part of Hungary. They were Donnerschwaben. Maybe you know this branch of the German Empire. And they came to America in the 1880s, 1890s, I think. And my grandfather learned to speak English for his trade, but my grandmother, they moved to Milwaukee. Milwaukee was the most German city in America. It was so German in the period around 1900 that it had 8 daily newspapers, 2 in English, 6 in German. And so my grandmother never needed to learn English. Her entire neighborhood, everyone spoke German. And so when she became quite old, she came to live with my mother, who also spoke German, and I heard German all the time. And I still remember a surprising amount of it. So when I have been walking through your beautiful city, I have seen a lot of signs and words and things I've heard that I understand. Verstehen ein bisschen Deutsch. So I'm delighted to be in Munich. I've had a great time, and I hope if there's some interesting things we can share tonight. I will talk about anything. As Michael said, I wear many hats in the comics industry. I think too many. But I started as a cartoonist, and very soon on, I was cursed with having a little bit more business sense than the average cartoonist. If any of you know artists, you know, and it's a cliche, but most artists, they don't care about business. And I had a natural sense for it, and so I became a publisher very early on, and this is why you see the conflict always between the two halves of myself. And then, besides that, I was an editor, and I have written books about comics, and I have been a literary agent, and I founded a legal organization. So I wish sometimes that I had just stayed cartooning full-time, but I didn't. But I drew enough that I can collect a book now and then and call myself an artist. But in the course of being a publisher, I got to meet and become friends with many great artists in America, including a couple of your guests, Robert Crumb, Gilbert Shelton, Will Eisner, Harvey Kurtzman, many others. And that's been a great pleasure, being a publisher and bringing their work to print. So I have no regrets. Life has been good.
So, how did you start in the comics business? What was your first steps?
Well, as a young boy, I collected American-style comic books, and they were very cheap. And in those days, they were not really collectors like now. I traded with boys in the neighborhood, and I liked all kinds, including Carl Barks and Uncle Scrooge, which I know is very popular here. But most of the boys in my neighborhood, they only like Superman and Batman. I like those too, but I found that I could trade one Superman and I could get 2 or 3 ducks or a little Lulu. And so this is how my collection grew. I didn't have much money, my family was poor. I had an allowance every week of 50 cents back in the 1950s. Comic books were 10 cents, so every week I could buy 5 comic books, new, and then I would trade. And early on I recognized that some artists and some stories were, to me, much better than others, and I began drawing myself and had a dream to be a cartoonist. But this was not something that was encouraged. I came from a working class family. They didn't understand how this kind of business worked. In my entire family, I only had one relative who had gone to college and was making a good living. So he was held up as a role model for me, and he was an engineer. Also from German, the same grandparents, but his father also came from Germany, so he was pure German. Keppel was his name, George Keppel. And so when I was in high school, every student must write a paper, a thesis on what occupation you will be when you grow up. And they said, make 2 or 3 choices, and then you must interview one of those professions. Well, of course, I really wanted to be a cartoonist, but to make my mother and other people happy, I put engineer number 1. And I went to interview my cousin because there were no cartoonists anywhere near where I lived. So he lived in not far away, and when I went to see him after work, he was in his backyard. He had a beautiful garden, flowers everywhere in nice neat rows, and he was down in his hands and knees digging in the garden. And he said, okay, what are your questions, Dennis? And I started to ask him without any enthusiasm. And after just a few minutes, he said to me, you don't really want to be an engineer, do you? And I said, no, not really, George. He said, well, let me tell you something. If I had it all to do over again, to start over, I would be a gardener. He said, follow your heart. And that was the best advice I ever had. I haven't thought about engineering since. And so, with that kind of liberated feeling, I just began drawing more and studying comics more. There was no place in America to really go to school to learn cartooning, so mostly I became self-taught. And when I went to college, I studied journalism, because my feeling was I can teach myself to draw, but a good cartoonist must be a good communicator. So I thought journalism would be better than English or any other study focusing on writing. And I think that was a good choice. It also taught me how journalists think. And so when I needed publicity, it came in very handy, because I knew early on how to manipulate is maybe the wrong word, but I knew what a good story was, and I could often suggest good stories. And some journalists and radio stations and TV stations, they get lazy, and if you give them a good idea and make them think it's their idea, then they will come and interview you. And so I had no money for advertising, so I got lots of free publicity, because I think my background in journalism was helpful. And so at the very beginning, after I left college, the Vietnam War was looming, and that's actually a whole other story, how I got out of the Army, but that's not about comics. But I...
maybe later in the Jewish Museum.
Yeah, maybe. So, so I decided I would draw my own comic book and I would publish it myself, because I was naive. I didn't know how to approach a real publisher, and also the kind of comics I wanted to draw were for other hippies like I was, and no mainstream publisher would have any interest. And at that time, I knew that everyone in 1968, 69, I did this, anyone with long hair, they could be a customer. It was very easy. It was us and them. And so I had enough money to print 4,000 copies, and I distribute them in Milwaukee, 3,500. And a roommate of mine was driving off to San Francisco, and he took the other 500, and he sold them there to a distributor. And I thought, well, this is an easy way to make a living. I can just make comics, but the business part was a necessity, collecting the money, dealing with the printer. So I got a call from the publisher in San Francisco, and he said, I would like to publish your work. And I said, great, that's what I wanted. So I sent my next comic to him. It was called Mom's Homemade Comics. And the real reason for the name was the next line is straight from the kitchen to you. So it was a play on words of my kind of silly name, Kitchen, which is the Irish half of me. And so I thought, this was great. I will now just draw comics, and the publisher will send me money. And I did eventually get a check, but the check came in an envelope without any explanation. And I thought that was curious. I wanted to know how many did they print, I wanted to know what percentage I was getting. It was very unclear because I rushed into it. So I called the publisher and I said, thank you for the money, but where is the explanation? And his next words were, are you calling me a crook? And I hadn't thought maybe he was a crook until he suggested it. Because he was still reluctant to tell me how many he printed, so I decided, okay, I had always heard publishers did not deal fairly with artists, and I had a natural mistrust. I had known Harvey Kurtzman's story with Mad, Siegel and Schuster's story with Superman, and I decided there are no honest publishers. I will just self-publish again, and so be it. And at that time, two other cartoonists who lived nearby in Chicago, they also had problems with the San Francisco publisher, and they said, if you are self-publishing, maybe you will publish ours as well. And at that point I said, the words that changed my life, I said, sure, two is as easy as one. But at that moment I became a publisher because I felt responsible for their book more than my own, because they were friends. And then, before long, there were 3, there were 4, there were 5 books, and then I got my first visit from Robert Crumb.
This was the beginning of Kitchen Sink Press?
This was the beginning of Kitchen Sink. And when Robert visited, we had a lot of things in common, and he said, I will give you my next book. And that was Homegrown Funnies. And that became a bestseller, and that made it easier. And it grew and grew.
I think you have sent Mom's Homemade Comics to Harvey Kurtzman, is it right?
Yes, again, it was probably a little bit naive, but growing up, Mad Magazine and the Mad Comics, they were great inspiration. And somehow I got his address in New York, and I sent him a copy of my first comic, and I was very surprised. He sent me a very nice, encouraging letter, and soon we became kind of pen pals. And I did the same with Stan Lee, who I didn't think I would ever get a reply, because even then Marvel was becoming very big, very popular. But Stan Lee loved my stationery. Letterhead. I always like to design interesting letterhead, and I changed them a lot. And whichever one I sent him, I think at the time I had an office in a part of Milwaukee above a laundromat. It was not a prestigious location at all, but on the letterhead, to make fun of myself, I said, located above the Polyprim laundromat on North Avenue, on the prestigious East Side, something like that. It made him laugh out loud, whatever, I can't remember exactly. And after we exchanged a few letters, he started asking me to come and work for him. And I admired him, but I had no interest in doing Marvel-style comics. I wanted to do underground comics. I was interested in breaking the rules, not following the rules. But these early connections, back then, I think were easier because maybe fewer people were writing letters. This was way before the internet, of course. And I was always good at writing letters. That was one of my strengths. And so I think maybe they thought I was someone that would be good to stay in contact with. And eventually I did end up working for Stan Lee. Maybe I'm getting ahead of the story.
But you worked a little for him. You had a magazine project.
Yeah, in 1973, remember, to put it in the perspective of years, 1967, Crumb did Zap, and that was the beginning. And so in the late 60s and the early 70s, there was a big boom in underground comics because every hippie had to read them. They would get stoned, read comics, laugh, whatever. And so in college dorms and pads and communes everywhere. We sold a lot of comics. People think this was a small business, but really we sold a surprising number of them through head shops. And like any...
Maybe you can explain for us what a head shops are.
They still exist in Amsterdam, but it's a place you could get rolling papers and pipes and bongs and t-shirts and posters, psychedelic posters, and always there would be a rack of comics, but only underground comics, not Marvel or DC style. And so that was our audience, and we sold a lot, believe me. Any new comic, even with an unknown artist, I would print 10,000 automatically, and usually have no problem selling 10,000, and then I would reprint again. Not always, but the good ones would just keep selling. So, but by 1973, we had a big problem in our cottage industry, and it was because of two things. First, we sold comics on a non-returnable basis. And the way in America all periodicals normally are sold is the publisher ships them to the newsstands, and they may be on the newsstands 30 days. What is unsold comes back, and the store only pays for the ones they sell. The publisher then pulps them, destroys the ones that didn't sell. With underground comics, we did it a very different way. We sold it at a deeper discount, so the shop could make a larger profit, but he could not return them. So we trusted that the shop knew they could sell 25 of this title. If they ordered 25, they were theirs. I didn't want them back. But if he only sold 15 or 20, he would have them left on the rack. New ones would come in. Soon, some of the shops had more comics that were not selling, because by then, you know, people had turned the corners and wrinkled them. And so that was one problem. The other was, in America, the Supreme Court had a new ruling on obscenity, and they decided they would not define obscenity. They would leave it up to individual districts, and that wasn't good, because that meant every head shop had to worry about local authorities deciding if the comics were obscene by the local standards. What are local standards? It would be maybe very different in Munich than Berlin, at least in the 1970s.
I think it is.
Yeah, that's what I'm told. So in 1973, suddenly I had a chart on my wall with sales, and our sales had been going up, up, up. I love my chart. And then suddenly they went down, down, down. And my partner at the time, he pasted a piece of paper on the chart so that I could go down below the chart as a joke, because things were not looking good. And at that time, I was about to call it quits. Stan Lee called, and he said, I'm going to try again to hire you. Are you interested? And suddenly I was interested, because I had a wife and a small baby, and I decided a paycheck would be a good idea. But I said, I don't want to do the kinds of comics you are doing now. They don't interest me anymore. I want to do something experimental. And he said, so do I. He said, let's do something experimental. So we made a magazine called Comics with an X, Comics Book. And I persuaded him, after many arguments, that he should change the way Marvel does business. Up until that time, they would pay a flat rate to an artist. They would own the copyright. They would keep the art. And there were very strict rules about the content. And so I persuaded him that the copyright should be limited to the first printing, that the art must be returned, and that they must at least be flexible with the content so that we could use swear words and some degree of nudity, and we could just not be a typical Marvel comic. So he reluctantly finally agreed, because I think Stan was then doing college lecture tours, making a lot of money as a celebrity. And he wanted to look hip. It was important to him, because he was at that time maybe 50 years old, and he wanted to relate to these college students. So he actually lost the argument, and I won the argument, and we began publishing. And on the first issue, I had everything ready to go to the printer except his title. He kept telling me I would think about what his own title will be. I was the editor, but I said, what are you? Are you the editor-in-chief? Are you the publisher? Are you the executive editor? You must tell me so I can send the book to the press. And he said, okay, Dennis. He said, call me the instigator. Now, this might not be a word that translates well, but it's an ambiguous word. So he said, if you get me in a lot of trouble, I can say, I was just the instigator. But if it's very successful, I will say, I was the instigator. That way he would win either way. So that was Stan being very crafty and smart. And ultimately, it was not a success. We did 5 issues, but it didn't really, the distributors didn't know what to do with it because it was not like the other Marvel comics. It was not like Mad. And, but it did pay the artists very well, and so I was able to work a year. Other artists who were starving at that time, they made a good amount of money. And we also reached a larger audience because Marvel would print 200,000 copies of each issue. And this was well beyond what we could reach through the head shops, except over a long period of time. So it was at the end of the year, I think, successful because a lot of people discovered us, then they began to look for us in other places. And so to this day, I still like Stan. We still stay in touch. I am doing a collection of that book, of Comix book, later this year, and he did a very nice introduction for it. So, so that was my brief experiment in the mainstream.
Great to hear that, because I'm looking for a long time for this.
Yeah, there were.
Which artists work for this book?
Well, people like Art Spiegelman, S. Clay Wilson, Kim Deitch, Justin Green, a lot of people who are still working today. Crumb refused. He would not work for Marvel under any circumstance. He is uncompromising, which is one reason we love him. Sometimes I compromise.
Okay, this is your comic book and publisher head. You also have the head of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. Can you tell us a little bit of the history of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund and what this organization do for the artists?
So, as you probably know, in America we have a constitution that has amendments, and the First Amendment, to some, is the most important, is the freedom of expression. So the law says we can say anything we want, except to yell fire in a theater, of course. But it's something that to a cartoonist, especially an underground cartoonist, it's very important because, as you know, sometimes we are dealing with themes that are unpopular to most people. They might be about drugs or sex or politics or anything of a controversial nature. And so it's important we be protected. In 1988, there was an incident in a suburb of Chicago where a shop was busted by police officers who took about, I think, 15 or 18 comic books and claimed that they were obscene. And one of them was published by me. It was Omaha, the Cat Dancer, which had erotic elements, but it was a very literary comic, one that I was proud of publishing. So I was very upset and indignant that they would bust it. And some of the other books they seized were really quite innocuous, things like Heavy Metal, which was a newsstand magazine, the American version of Metal Hurlant, and things by Richard Corbin, things that were not obscene. But the police pressed charges, and they took this manager of the shop to court, and they convicted him. And he was going to have to pay a very large fine and 1 year in jail. And I was so upset that I contacted him and the man who owned the store, And I said, we must appeal the case. In America, the next step is called the appellate court. And so to do that, you need a specialty attorney who knows the First Amendment law, and it's difficult to overturn a decision. You win it on usually technicalities because the first judge has made his opinion. So I went to find the best First Amendment attorney that I could find, and he said it would take about $25,000 for this case in 1988. So I went to a lot of the artists that I knew, like Crumb and Eisner, and I think there were 10 or 12, and I said, can you do a plate for a portfolio and sign it? And they all said yes. And I went to the printer and I said, will you just charge the price without a profit? He said yes. I went to the distributors and I said, will you sell it to the shops without a profit? And they said yes. So we raised enough money to pay for this attorney, and he overturned the case, and so the manager was free. And then there was money left over, and I wasn't sure what to do with the money, and I decided, well, maybe we should make this a permanent organization, because maybe there are other cases. And it turned out there were lots of these cases, but usually we didn't know about them. I knew about this one because the owner of the store called me. But there were many cases, especially in the south of America, what we call the Bible Belt, which is very conservative. A lot of times a police officer might come into the shop and intimidate the owner. And he might just say, Michael, I think you should remove these titles if you want to be a smart businessman. I will not bother you. So usually you will take those offensive comics down and to have peace with the local politics. So this happened, I found out many times, but retailers usually, they couldn't afford a special lawyer. And so even though the First Amendment protected the artist, protected the retailer, local, not just policemen, but sometimes a prosecutor, they would use intimidation tactics. And so once we started the fund, we hired full-time an executive director, and we began relationships with our lawyers all over the country who were willing to donate time or at a special lower rate. And we had an 800 telephone number, so anytime a shop was intimidated or busted, they would call this number and we would immediately give them legal assistance. And suddenly there were cases all over America. And fortunately, we win about 90% of them. Occasionally there is a loss for various reasons, and usually it's because the retailer was stupid with selling it to someone who was too young or whatever. But anyway, now we have this organization, and it protects mostly the shop owners, but also it helps the artists, the editors, the publishers know that the First Amendment rights are protected.
So many amendments, I think this won't work. The financing was just doing prints and sell them. You did something else for the financial base of Comic Book Legal Defense Fund?
I'm not sure.
I think you made a cruise.
Oh yes, we did. We in the year 2000, maybe you know, sometimes there is a cruise where you go on a boat with celebrities, and so you pay the normal price for a cruise, but you get to hang out with people you like or respect. So we decided to do that with famous cartoonists. So we had Frank Miller and Will Eisner and the Hernandez brothers and Chris Ware and I think about 15 or 20 famous cartoonists, and then the fans could pay the normal cruise price, I think about $2,000. And then for 1 week we went from the Southern California down the coast of Mexico and back. And so you could go to the bar and have a beer with Frank Miller or Will Eisner or Hernandez brother of your choice. And
Denis
they were, well, and they were obligated to spend time with you, because normally that would, maybe in Europe it's easier to meet the artists and get sketches and things, but in America At conventions, usually you have a minute to get an autograph and never a chance to talk. So for some fans who could afford the cruise, they had a great time, and everyone knew it was for a good cause. So yeah, we try to be creative to raise money.
And what are you actually doing with Comic Book Legal Defense Fund? Still the amendments, or
Well,
does it change a little bit?
I was the president of it for 18 years, and it takes a lot of time. So finally I resigned. I thought it's also good to have fresh blood, new people to come in, and so that's what happened. And now we have term limits. So all the officers can only serve about 6 years, and then they must make way for someone new. So I think that's a good way.
With the actual head of Comics, who is actually there?
Well, the executive director is Charles Brownstein. Every day he runs it, but then there's a board of directors of 9. And we make sure the board consists of all the elements of the industry. So there are creators, publishers, distributors, and retailers. So everyone has a voice.
Okay, and your next job is the work as a literary agent. Maybe you talk a little bit of which artists you're working with. And I know the story when you met Will Eisner the first time. And I think this is a very funny one with Will Eisner, Art Spiegelman, and you.
Okay, yes. I went to my first comics convention in New York in 1971. I got to know the organizer, somebody named Phil Suling. And that same year he also invited Will Eisner. And so I went to New York, which for me was a big adventure because I live in Milwaukee. I didn't travel very much in those days. And so, as with any fan, I was going through the tables looking for back issues, and somebody tapped me on the shoulder, and it was French comics historian Maurice Horn. He was a guest, one of the earliest, I think, to write seriously about comics. And he had seen my badge with my name, and he said, "Oh, Will Eisner, he is looking for you." And I said, "No, you must be mistaken. I do not know Mr. Eisner." He said, No, he told me if I see you, he wants to talk to you." So I said, "If you are not crazy, then okay, bring me to him." And he did. And what was amazing, because even then, in 1971, Will Eisner, he was a living legend. And I was just beginning my career, and I had no idea why he wanted to meet me, but then I found out. Will Eisner is not a typical cartoonist. He is a fresh thinker. He's always looking ahead, and he looks at what young artists are doing. And he was intrigued by the underground comics for practical reasons. And so he brought me into a private room he had in the hotel, and he asked me if I could confirm some of the things he had heard. And he said, "Is it true the artists keep their own copyright?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, and you return the art?" I said, "Yes." "And they can write and draw anything they want?" I said, "If it's good, yes."
Like Marvel says too.
Yeah. And so he said, "Well, I wish I had those things when I was young." He said, "This is wonderful." He said, you were tempting me to come back into the business." And I said, that would be great. We would love to have you back in the business." Because by then, he was not doing normal comics. He was doing educational comics and even comics for large corporations and the army. And they were good, but they were not the stories fans wanted to see. And so after we talked for a while, and keep in mind that at that moment Will Eisner was wearing a 3-piece suit with a tie and very well dressed, and I had tie-dyed bell-bottom jeans, a very scraggly beard, very long hair. And as Will said later, he said, "Denis and I both smoked pipes, but with different substances." And so then he said, "Well, this all sounds great," but he said, "I haven't actually seen any of these comics. Can you show me?" So I said, sure. So we went back to the floor of the convention, and we went to a dealer's table, and he had all the underground spread out on maybe like 2 tables like this. And before I could pick one out, Will just grabbed one from the pile, and it was S. Clay Wilson. And he opened it up, and he opened to a page where a pirate was taking a sword and chopping off the penis of another pirate and taking it with a fork and eating it, saying, "The head tastes best." And Will looked at this, and suddenly the generation gap became clearer. And he didn't understand just how far we had broken the rules. And so he started to act like a 50-year-old, and I tried to defend what we were doing, or, I mean, I didn't draw that page, but I tried to explain why S. Clay Wilson might have done that. And standing next to us was a young artist who was just beginning in the industry, was totally unknown, and his name was Art Spiegelman. And he started arguing. And Will became, after a while, very tired of this argument, and he excused himself, and he walked away, and I thought, I will never speak to him again. But I had his business card. So after the convention, I wrote to him, and I said, I think what you picked was not necessarily typical of what we are doing, and I would like to send you other examples. So he said, okay, give me a second look. So I very carefully picked underground comics that might appeal to a 50-year-old artist. This time it worked.
Which, do you still know some of the titles?
It probably is in my files and my correspondence, okay. But offhand I don't remember. But it might have also included crumb and just not the most outrageous material. And he liked these. And so at that point he said, okay, I would like to get back into the business. And it started with me asking him if I could reprint The Spirit. And he said, oh, kids these days don't want to read that old material. And I assured him I thought there might be an audience. So we tested it, and there was. And that was the first time I started doing old classics and not just undergrounds by contemporary artists, because I thought it was important for us to preserve the historical comics that were already very rare, difficult to find. The Spirit, as you know, perhaps some of you know, was not really a comic book originally. It was an insert into newspapers. It was not like any other comic. And so most people in the 1940s, they would read it, throw it away with the newspaper. They were very rare. So, so that began a very, very long relationship. And Will, in his mid-50s, then created a Contract with God, which was the first of about 20 graphic novels. And had just finished one when he died, just short of 88 years old. So it was kind of a remarkable second career.
And how was the start with Harvey Kurtzman?
Well, with Harvey, again, I started writing to him, and then eventually I went to visit him, and he was already aware of undergrounds because Crumb and Shelton had also sent him samples, and he was in touch with the French artists who were beginning to do experimental comics, and so for him it was also a wonderful opportunity, but he was working for Hugh Hefner, so he couldn't do as much as Will Eisner had already been a successful businessman. And so Will Eisner could quit his job and just do what he wanted because he had enough money in the bank. Harvey Kurtzman was not like that. Harvey was not a good businessman. You may know the story. He created Mad, and then he had a fight with the publisher and left Mad, and then the publisher sold Mad for $5 million, and Harvey got nothing. So when, in fact, I can tell you a funny story. Just a couple of years ago, the widows, Mrs. Eisner and Mrs. Kurtzman, were having lunch with me. and Mrs. Kurtzman said, Harvey Kurtzman always asked Will Eisner for advice, but he never took it. And he just wasn't capable of making the smart decisions. He was a pure artist. And Will Eisner was also, a businessman and an artist, which is helpful. But most artists don't have that gene. So, but sometimes Harvey would do a guest cover for us, and he was always great just as a friend, and eventually I started then collecting his old work, like Hey Look, and Goodman Beaver, and things that have been out of print for a long time, Jungle Book, and more recently, about I think 4 years ago, I did a big book in America called The Art of Harvey Kurtzman, a big, expensive dedication to his career.
Expensive for the production.
Well, yeah, I mean, no, it's not.
So that I think for the book the price is very fair.
Yeah.
Really, for me, it's one of the best
Okay.
art books in the comic business.
Well, thank you for that endorsement.
Of course.
You once told me a story that one time you wanted to quit as a literary agent, and then you have talked with Will Eisner and Harvey Kurtzman. I think this is a funny story too.
Well, actually, not as a literary agent. No, I was still a publisher.
Oh, as a pub.
Yeah.
Publisher, that's it. Yeah.
Kitchen Sink Press, which was it ultimately lasted 30 years. But remember, I never planned to be a publisher, and always in the back of my mind, I thought I want to return to cartooning. And so, sometime around I think 1980, I knew I was going to New York on business, and both Will Eisner and Harvey Kurtzman lived there, and I always would visit them, stay with them a day or two, and then come home. And I made up my mind I was going to tell them that I was going to get out of publishing, that they must find a new publisher, because I was going to go back to the drawing board. And I knew when I did this that Harvey would understand, because he was a pure artist, and Will would try to talk me out of it. So, first I went to visit Will, and after we conducted our usual business at the end, I said, now I have some other news for you. I said, I must tell you, in a short term to end our current business, I am going to get out of publishing, and I want to give you advance notice. And he said, well, if that's your decision, I respect it, and I wish you the best. I will help you if I can. It's a brave thing to do. Good luck. So I said goodbye to him, and I thought, wow, that was easy. Then I went to see Harvey, and when it was time to leave, I told him the same decision, and he said, no, you must not. He said, good publishers are very rare. He said, we need you. You must not quit. I will not let you. I said, Harvey, please don't make me keep doing this. And he said, no, you must. So I went back on the plane, and I went home, and I thought about it, and I decided, okay, I will stick it out a little bit longer. And so I did. It was the complete opposite of what I expected, and I realized I thought I knew both of them very well, but I could not predict their reaction.
So maybe some questions from the audience?
Do you remember what, in the end, you wrote that essay on what you want to be when you grow up?
I think to make my teacher happy, I talked about what a great career in engineering would be. But I knew in my heart that I would not be. The assignment was one thing, but I had already made my decision here. But on the cover, I drew. One of the things my teachers tolerated was that I could illustrate my papers. This was not the normal rule. And so on the cover I had a cartoonist who was smiling and holding up a drawing, and an engineer who had numbers and calculus in his head and looked very grim. So I think the message on the cover, I found it recently, and clearly any teacher would have realized what I really wanted, because the cartoonist was happy, the engineer was not happy with his calculations.
More questions, please?
Do you still make reprints? Or and what reprints do you make?
Well, I was out of publishing in recent years. I have focused on other things, but now, starting next month, I'm starting Kitchen Sink again. And
Good use.
this is not official yet. It will be
We will say it on Facebook.
Thank God there is no internet, but the official announcement will be next month, and I will use the Kitchen Sink imprint, but it will be an imprint of Dark Horse books in America. And so the reason I decided to do it is I have a younger partner who's very enthusiastic, and Dark Horse will do all the parts of publishing that are not fun. We will do the creative part, they will do the manufacturing and the distribution and the marketing. And so we have agreed to do 4, maybe 5 or 6 books each year, and we will start with reprints of the Stan Lee magazine I mentioned, and then Jungle Book by Hardy Kurtzman, and some things that were reprinted many years ago but are out of print, and in some cases we found new material, like in Jungle Book, some pages that were not used. Also, Hey Look, we will do in color.
How about Goodman Beaver?
Goodman Beaver with missing stories and missing pages, and with each one a new essay. And so we have about 20 books we plan to do over the next 2 or 3 years, and so I still think in my head I'm a young man and I can do all these things, so while I have the energy.
Good to know that, because when I was a child, really Kitchen Sink for me was a label that I picked up comic books when I went to a comic store. I didn't know the artists and the stories, but I thought, okay, when Kitchen Sink will publish them, they seem to be good. And really, I think at least 95% was a good choice.
Well, see, that's the best endorsement. I like to hear that, because most people don't look at who the publisher is. They just, you know, some publishers take pride in what they do.
The thing from James Vance was one of the books I found for you.
Kings
in
in Disguise.
Disguise, yeah, that's it.
There is not a sequel to that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's called On the Ropes. So, a publisher in America called Norton, N-O-R-T-O-N. If you can find, they've reprinted Kings in Disguise, and the sequel is On the Ropes. They're wonderful. So.
More questions from the audience, maybe? Otherwise, I have a question. But you start.
If there are no more questions, maybe now you could tell us how you got out of the army.
Well, all right. I will give you the short version. So as you can imagine, I'm a long-haired hippie, and I have just gotten out of college in 1968, and the Vietnam War is reaching its height, and America has a draft. So any young man coming out of college is eligible to be drafted. So I went to, we had in colleges a draft counselor. He looked like Karl Marx. He had a big beard like this, and he helped young men find an excuse to get out. But there were only a few ways you could get out, and one was to be a conscientious objector. You were morally opposed to war. And I was. But he said, well, you are coming to me too late to prove that you are. And I said, well, I know what I am. He said, no, you must show that you belong to a religious organization. You can't just say you object. Well, I had no religious basis for that, so I said, okay, how else can I get out? And he said, well, do you have anything physically wrong with you? I said, I am nearsighted. I am very nearsighted. He said, that's not good enough. What else? I couldn't think of anything else. I said, I'm skinny. How skinny must you be? So he looked on the chart, and maybe you saw when I came in, I'm very tall. And he said, well, to get out for your height, you must be 138 pounds. This is very, very thin. But I was only about 15 pounds away. So I said, okay, I will starve myself. Because I got a notice from the Army. I had, I think, 60 days to come in for a physical. So I began to eat less and less and get thinner and thinner. I show up for my physical was the next day, and I got 1 pound below. And I was so happy. I celebrated with my friends. I had many beers. And I celebrated too early. And when I showed up, I was 1 pound over. And they immediately put me on a plane and sent me to Fort Knox, Kentucky. And within a few hours, my long hair was gone. I was in a uniform, and I was very frightened. And I was sitting in an army barracks, despairing and wishing that I had gotten a ticket to Canada. But it was too late, and in the bunk next to me, there was another soldier who was equally desperate, and he was heavy, but not quite heavy enough. And they told us we would have a final physical in 15 days. And so I said to him, how about, this is not so good for me, but you will eat my food in the next 15 days, most of it, because they were marching us. And if I refused to eat, I would go into the army jail. But if I could each day give him, you know, I'd say, I don't like mashed potatoes, you take them. I don't like meat, you take them. And so we did that. But I really needed to eat just to march. So I was afraid I still wasn't losing enough weight. So the day of the final exam, I knew that if I was under 138 or under, I would be out. If I was over, I would be sent to Vietnam, and I was sure I wouldn't come back. So on that day, I went into an office about this big, and the doctor was on one corner, and on the other corner was a young man who I didn't realize he had already been discharged. He was helping the doctor. And so the doctor looked at my chart and began checking things off, and he said, so we have a little bit of a weight problem, Private Kitchen. He said, get up on the scale over there, and if you are 138 or less, then we will discharge you. So I went, and I stepped on the scale, and it was 139. But the young man who was reporting to the doctor, he looked in my eyes, and then he said to the doctor, 137. And probably saved my life. And I never knew his name. I never saw him again. And he knew what he was doing. So I was greatly relieved. And the doctor said, if you want to stay, we will fatten you up. And I said, so when you come to the fort, they fly you on a plane. But when you are kicked out, they put you on a bus. So I got on a bus with the soldier who also was eating my food. He also just barely got out. And his name was, I think, Michael Peach. And so we drove the bus back to Milwaukee, and then I never saw him again. And then many years later, I was at a party. Maybe some of you know the comic book Nexus, or Badger. It's written by a writer named Mike Barron, who lives in Madison, Wisconsin. So I was at a party with him and drinking, and he said, hey, my banker says he knows you. I said, I don't know any bankers in Madison. And he said, yes, Michael Peach, he says he knows you. The fat guy became a banker.
questions from me? Or are there other questions from the audience? Okay, maybe in a short version, tell us a little bit. You were the guy who was behind the Genesis project with Robert Crumb, and maybe you can tell, but just a little on your Al Capp book, so the people have to go at 7 o'clock to the Jewish Museum to know much more.
Smart marketing, Michael. When Kitchen Sink was still in business, I would usually go to Angoulême every year, and then I would make a side trip to visit Crum in the south of France. And the last year, I think it was 1999, before Kitchen Sink went under, we talked about what project to do next, and Robert told me he wanted to do the story of Genesis in the Bible, but he wanted to do it seriously. And I said, well, that's an unusual thing, but all right, let's do it. But then 1 year later, Kitchen Sink was out of business, and so it didn't happen. I assumed he would talk to someone else about it, but he never did. So about 8 years later, I was having a meeting with an editor in New York, and he was a fan of Crum, and he said, is there a project that we could do with Crum? And I was not his agent, I was just his friend, but I remembered that project, and I said, well, he always wanted to do the book of Genesis in a serious way, and the editor said, I would publish that in 1 minute. So I said, well, let me call him. So I called Robert, and I said, do you still want to do that? And he said, well, I would, but it would take a long time, and he said I would need a significant amount of money. So I asked him to name the price, and he named his price, and I went back and got him twice the price, and he said, okay. But it took him twice as long to do. So I know some fans, they don't like this book, because it's not...
The problem is only the story, not the drawings.
Right. What I think, they wonder, well, why wasn't he making fun of the religion or satirizing it? But to him, it's just such a strange, strange story. He just wanted to tell it exactly the way it was. And I know a lot of atheists and agnostics finally have read Genesis, and some Christians who read it see it in a different way, because there's, as you know, a lot of depravity and a lot of sex and strangeness in that book, and so Robert became a bit of a biblical scholar in the process of doing that, and every word is exactly from in fact, the Torah version. It's not the King James version, or it's the best translation that is known. So there it is, for better or worse. Some people hate it, some people love it, but I am responsible. If you hate it, I'm sorry. But it's beautifully done, and he likes to do serious things sometimes.
So how about your Al Capp book? Even shorter version.
Okay.
The long version will be at 7.
In America, Al Capp was a very, very famous cartoonist, probably the most famous during his lifetime. He's not well known in Germany because his work is very difficult to translate. The characters were hillbillies, people who lived in the mountains in Appalachia. But in America it was hugely popular, kind of like Asterisk or Tauntaun would be here. And he went from poverty, and as a boy he lost a leg when he was 9 years old, so a one-legged man who was very poor became very quickly a multi-millionaire. And not just a cartoonist, but a media personality, because he was on television shows, radio shows, he had his own newspaper column, he gave lectures at colleges. Everybody knew Al Capp. He was extremely famous. And he also was someone with a very dark side, because he was what today we would call a sexual predator. And he used his fame to take advantage with women, especially later in life. When he was younger, he was charming and rich and good-looking, but later he resorted to very devious means, and ultimately was arrested, and ultimately was disgraced, and his career went down the tubes, and he died very soon after. So his career had always fascinated me, so I wrote a biography with another writer, and it just came out 3 months ago. And it's been getting great reviews in the New York Times and Washington Post and all the biggest papers in America. And a lot of people who, in America, who remember him, they don't really remember the detail. And we found some of his victims, and we found a lot of correspondence and things that were never public before. So I told this to Michael when I met Michael about 2 years ago, and he said he wanted to read it. So I sent it to him, and I think he also enjoyed it. So we are having a panel at 7 o'clock on that. I will have a PowerPoint. If you're curious, and you're not already sick of comics, I invite you to come.
Many thanks. Ja, vielen Dank. Spannend, und das ist tatsächlich ein faszinierender Künstler, faszinierender Zeichner, der leider in Deutschland viel zu wenig bekannt ist. Also ich denke, wenn man sich für klassische Comics interessiert, ist das eine sehr, sehr spannende Geschichte. Und eben auch diese dunkle Seite von ihm, die Dennis mir viel, viel ausführlicher schon geschildert hat, als er das jetzt in den paar Minuten konnte, war so spannend, dass das für mich fast ein Krimi war. Also auch unter den Damen, die er sexuell bedrängt hat, waren da diverse Prominente. Grace Kelly, Goldie Hawn, it was Grace Kelly and Goldie Hawn.
I'm sorry.
I think it was Grace Kelly and Goldie Hawn.
Yes, they were the most famous.
Ja. Also insofern glaube ich, ist das auch eine spannende Geschichte heute Abend um 7 Uhr. Es würde mich natürlich freuen, den einen oder anderen von euch dort dann wieder zu sehen. Also bis später. Danke, tschüss.